Hi, my name is Meng and welcome back to a 29th session of the SwiftUI course. So today we're going to learn something really useful, especially when you're dealing with data. So far we've learned that we can store text, images, and so on. But what if we store states as well so that we don't have to manually set a different state every single time and still be able to use binding for these instances of the card component? So let's start from the beginning. We're going to go at the very bottom of the document and we're going to set the data model. So far, we haven't really set any looping of these cards yet. So first, we're going to set the data model. We're going to type struct course colon identifiable curly braces, and we're going to start with var id is equal to UUID parentheses. Then we're going to set the title, so var title of type string, var subtitle of type string as well, and we're going to set the image literal and color literal, and this time we're going to use the UI image value instead, so it's going to make our data shorter as a result. So var image of type UI image, var logo of type UI image, var color of type UI color, and this is the different part, which is var show of type boolean. So this is going to store the show state for each of the cards. For the data, I've shown you multiple times, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time creating each of them. We can just copy and paste from the text content of this course. And it's very simple. Var course data is equal an array, and each array is using the data model, and you just need to fill the title, subtitle, image using image literal for the logo as well, and the color literal. And for the show, we're going to set it to false by default for each of those cards. So now we're going to scroll back at the very top, and we're going to create a new state. And this time is going to use our data. So state var courses is equal to course data, which is our sample data. And now we're ready to loop through our data and apply a course view with the geometry reader for every single card. And that also means that we don't need to code these manually anymore. So we can just delete the first course view. And then we're gonna command click on geometry reader. We can put repeat. This will simply manually repeat 5 times the same record. Let me just fix the error first. We need the self since we're inside of for each. So insert self each of them and try again. This should allow us to see 5 cards. And this is all scrollable. But the problem is it's using the show to state for every single card, that is with repeat. Now, instead of using the manual repeat, we're going to use actual data. But this time, instead of looping through the courses, we're going to get the index value so that we can apply the states. And the index value is going to be very useful later on. So let's start with looping through the data. We're going to do courses dot indices, and then we're also going to need the ID. So comma ID colon backslash dot self. This is going to provide the index. So instead of item, we're going to set index. Now, since we're not getting the item value as a whole, we're going to have to use the root courses array as a whole and just use the index to target the specific value that we want. So here for course view for show, instead of saying self.show2, we're going to set $courses, and here I'm going to use the index, so square brackets and index. So now I'm targeting a specific data in this array using the index value, and then at the end after the square brackets dot show, which is the state. Now this $sign is necessary because the show is a binding, otherwise it's not necessary. So let's do the rest. The second one for the offset is going to be dot courses, square brackets, index, and then after the square brackets, dot show. And I can just copy and paste the whole thing. So self.courses index value dot show. I'm gonna copy and paste to the other self.show too. And voila. So now when I tap on each of these cards, it's going to get the proper full screen mode for each of them using their offset values from the geometry reader. I mean, this is kind of magical. Now you're noticing that there's a bit of sudden transition here. So we're gonna have to add an animation here right after dot frame for the VStack. So dot animation dot spring, and we're gonna use the response to 0.5, damping 0.6, and then blend 0. So this should fix our animation transition. And now that we're using the states from our data, we don't need these manual states anymore. So show and show to is not necessary anymore. So we can just delete them. And we're gonna go to course view. So command and click course view, jump to definition, and now we can start applying the course data. So var course of type course using our data model. Let's go ahead and replace the values. We're gonna scroll down a little bit and we're gonna find SwiftUI13. This is going to be replaced by course.title. Then the next text where it says 20 sections is going to be course.subtitle. For the logo, we're gonna delete it and replace it with course.logo. And for the next image, course.image. Then these two color literal, we're gonna replace by course.color. And then also for the shadow, course.color. So we still have an error. That's because we haven't passed the course variable to our component. So we're gonna go back to course view, and this is where we're gonna pass the missing value. So for course, we're gonna set self.courses parentheses index. And there you go, we can resume this and we should be able to see all of our cards using our data, the colors, the titles, and also the states, which is kind of amazing. Now, one tiny detail is that when we press here, you can see that it's pushing the other cards. And maybe that's what you want, but it also comes with some sort of a problem sometimes. So when I click here and tap here, it starts from this position sometimes. Let me explain what's happening. We are using the geometry reader, and the geometry reader is setting the size to the full height. And it's going to push the cards after the current card. So this will push the third card. This one will push the second and the third. Now, maybe that's what you want, but there's another way that we can do this, which is to always keep the same height. But for the content itself, we're going to maximize it. So let's do that. We're gonna set the frame to a height of 280 always. And you're gonna see that it's simply repositioning, but it keeps the frame of the geometry reader to 280 at all times. Therefore, it's not pushing the cards after. And for the component itself, so we're gonna jump to course view, we're gonna go to the very end, and here right before animation, we're gonna set dot frame parentheses. We're gonna set height colon show question mark screen dot height, otherwise 280. So even though this content is going to be expanding bigger than the actual frame of geometry reader, it is still visible because there's no clipping going on. So I'm gonna go back to the very top. You can see that this is my container from the geometry reader, and it's always taking the same height, but it is still expanding because there's no clipping. Now this is our animation. It is fixing the problem that we had before, which sometimes this would start from the top. And it also introduced a new problem, which is the z-index. So the cards after will be always on top of the first card. And that's something I'm going to teach you in the next session. But before doing that, I just want to add a title at the top. So right before for each, I'm going to set text, parentheses, quotes, courses, and then I'm going to set dot font, dot large title, and set it to dot bold parentheses. Let me set the frame, so dot frame max width to dot infinity. So I'm taking the full width and I'm going to align within that frame. So comma, alignment dot leading. Let me add some padding to the left. So padding dot leading, comma 30. And for the top, dot padding, parentheses, dot top, comma, I'm going to set this one to 30. Awesome. You might have guessed, in the next session, we're going to learn how to fix this z-index issue. Also, we're going to have some background animation, and we're also going to animate the status bar. Hope to see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome back to a 30th session of this SwiftUI course. It's kind of amazing that you've made this far. So today, I'm going to teach you some z-index tricks. So right now we have this animation here, and if it's before the cards that sit on top, they're gonna simply sit on top. So what we need to do is to change the z-index so that the card that we're tapping is going to be on top of every single other cards. So we're gonna go to the geometry reader. So this is where we are after frame, and we're going to add a new modifier called .z-index. And this is simply expecting a number, so we're going to do that. We're going to first ask if the card is active, so self.courses, square brackets index dot show question mark. If it's active, then set it to 1, otherwise set it to 0. What this means is that by default, all the cards have a z-index of 0, but if it's active, it's going to be on top, and therefore the second card and the first card, for example, will have to be on top of the other cards after. So that's pretty simple. If you ever get into a trouble where there's one element that you want to animate and you want it to be on top of another element, then you use the z-index modifier. Next, I want to show you how to animate the status bar, so we can hide it and we can show it back again. To do that, we're going to have to add a modifier to the scroll view. So right after dot animation, we can set dot status bar and parentheses hidden, and we are expecting a boolean, and we can set it to true, and therefore you should be able to hide the status bar. But now we want to animate this. And since we're not inside the loop, we won't be able to use the current card show state. We're going to have to set up a general active state that will be true every time that any of these cards will be set to full screen. So first of all, we're going to go to the course view, and we're going to set a new binding right after var course. We're going to set binding var active, and this is going to be of type boolean. So now whenever we activate the show, we're also going to activate active. So let's go to the tab gesture, which if you scroll down to roughly line 111, you're going to find on tab gesture, and here we're going to set self.active.toggle. And now we're going to scroll at the very top and put the state. So state var active is equal to false by default, and add that missing variable to our course view. So active colon, and we're gonna set it to the state using $active, and make sure to add the self. So this provides us with a general state called active, and we can use that to animate our status bar. So we're going to say active question mark, set hidden to true, otherwise set it to false. I'm going to resume this. And now whenever I tap on any card, the status bar will just disappear. I can decide to animate this using a transition. So I can do .animation .linear, and this is the timing of my animation, and you're going to see a little fade in and fade out animation. We can also use that active state to, let's say, blur the text. So .blur radius is going to set active question mark. We're going to set it to 20, otherwise 0. So now when we click here, it also blurs the background title. Another thing we can do is to change the background color. And for this, we're going to have to wrap everything inside a Z stack and use a color element. So we're going to command click scroll view, embed in V stack, and change from V stack to Z stack as a parent container. And right before scroll view, we're going to get color.black, and we're going to change the opacity to, let's say, 0.5 on active. So let's add active question mark to 0.5, otherwise 0. So this will only apply when we are in full screen mode. You can see that it's not taking advantage of the safe area, so we can just do that by adding .edge, ignoring safe area, .all. And we can add the transition before .edge, so .animation, and we can set it to linear, for example. So this is what we have so far. You can see that the background is changing its color, the title is blurring, and the status bar is disappearing. It's still not perfect. So for example, when you come back from the full screen, the second cards are appearing way too fast. And basically what we're going to try to do now is to animate the other card and not the main card. And in order to do that, we're going to need to get the index value of each card and only animate the cards that are not the current card. So that's what we're going to learn in the next session. I'll see you then. Hey there. Today we are at section 31, and we're going to learn how to pass the index value, how to get the current index value, and using those values, we're going to be able to animate a specific card. Let's say all the other cards except the current one that is being activated. So that's going to allow us, for example, on full screen mode, then to, let's say, make the other ones disappear or to make them move elsewhere. And I think that's going to be interesting to learn. So the first thing is we're going to take a look at what values that we have. So you can see that in the for each, we're looping through the courses and we're getting the index value. And using this index value, we know that card 1 has index 0, 1, 2, and so on. We just need to pass that value to the actual component and then save it as part of the state, and then use that saved index to animate specific cards. So first of all, I'm going to command click on course view, jump to definition, and this is where I'm going to set up new variables. So first of all, I'm going to set var index of type integer, which means that this is required. I'm not going to put a default value, and then I'm going to set a binding var active index of type integer. Let me just be consistent with the columns, and then I can pass those values. So I'm going to scroll back at the very top, and here I'm going to input the missing values for my course view. So fix, and the index is going to receive from the index of our loop. And then we're also going to miss the active index. So comma active index. And here, before filling it out, I'm going to set my state for active index. So state var active index of default -1. So for me, -1 would mean nothing, since in the index world, we always start with a 0. So the first card would be 0, 1, 2, and then so on. So here, for the value of active index, I'm going to set self.active index. Since this is a binding, I'm going to have to add the $sign as well. This is getting a bit long, so I'm gonna change the indentation. So show is going to be on its own line, and then course active index, and then active index. We can also put the end of our parentheses in another line. So now that we have this set up, when the user taps on any of these cards, so using the onTap gesture event, we're going to be able to set the state for the active index. So I'm going to go to course view, jump to definition, and I'm going to find the onTap gesture again, which is roughly line 129. And right at the end, I'm going to set a condition. So if self.show, which means when we're tapping on the card and it's active, curly braces, I'm going to set the self.active index to self.index. I'm also going to set the else statement. So otherwise, I'm going to change the self.active index to -1, which is nothing. So by doing this, since active index is a binding, I'm able to pass the value of the index when the card is active to be able to use that number and know which card is being active and which cards are not. So let me scroll back at the top to find course view. And right after .offset, I'm going to set the opacity for the other cards. So this card here that is not the current index, I'm going to set, okay, if the self.active index is not equal to the index, which basically means if the card is not the one being activated. And I also have to set an end self.active. So we're only animating while the card is being activated. Question mark, and we're gonna set it to 0, so meaning that it's gonna have opacity of 0, otherwise 1 by default. So you're gonna see that when I go to full screen and I come back, the second card is going to fade out, and it's going to be a lot smoother because of that opacity change. So this is much better. Of course, I can play with more animations, so let's do that. We're gonna set .scale effect. And instead of retyping this long condition, I'm just going to copy the whole line from self to the question mark and then paste it here as a condition and set the scale to 0.5 when active, otherwise 1. So now you're going to be able to see some scale change on the other cards except the main one. Let's do one final one, which is the offset. So .offset. We're going to change the X position. Now I'm going to paste the same condition. So self.active index is not equal to index and self.active question mark. And then I'm going to set it to screen.width. So I'm going to move it to the same width of the screen to the right, and otherwise not move it at all by just putting 0. So let's see what's going on. When I tap here, the other cards just move to the right at the distance of the screen width. And I think that's pretty cool. So please keep in mind that you can do so many kinds of animations at this point. I just wanted to show you that you can animate the main cards, the other cards, the status bar, or the background. And I definitely encourage you to play with this and come up with some crazy concepts. In the next session though, we're going to deal with gestures. So when we are in the full screen mode, I want to be able to drag down and have some scale effect, and be able to just animate back to the original screen. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'll see you in your next session. Hi, and welcome back to the 30-second session of the SwiftUI course. Today we're going to add some really interesting drag gesture when we are in the full screen mode. So we're going to drag and then we're just going to scale it. We're going to add some cool effects, and then we're going to deal with drag limits as well as scrolling behaviors while working with these advanced interactions. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and jump to the course view component. Then we're going to set a state called var active view. It's going to have a default of cg_size.0. Then I'm going to add a gesture right next to onTap gesture, but I'm going to put it before .onTap gesture at line roughly 132. I'm going to put .gesture parentheses, and here I'm going to put drag gesture parentheses. Let me put this inside its own line. And then after drag gesture, I'm going to add the event. So .unchanged. Here, I'm just gonna add curly braces, value in, enter. So now we are inside the curly braces. And now we're going to update the state of active view. So self.activeView is equal to value.translation. While we're here, let's deal with the unreleased as well. .unended, curly braces, make sure to put value in, and we're going to set it so that we can reset the position. So self.activeView is equal to .0. So whenever we drag, we're going to get the translation updated to our active view, and then when we release, it's going to reset that value. Now we're going to use that value, and we're going to, instead of using an offset modifier, we're going to use a scale effect. So I'm going to go to the Z stack here right after frame and type .scale effect. And we're going to start with 1 minus the number that we get for any time that we change the position and drag. Obviously this number is really big, which is why we're going to do self.activeView.height divided by 1000. So our height here is when we drag up and down, and that number is really big because, you know, every single pixel represents 1. So this number can be between 0 to almost 1000, which is why we have to divide that by 1000. But the scale effect is between 0 and 1, so, or 2. So what we need to do is to set it to a default of 1. Therefore, this will start at 0, and it will eventually be 0.1, 0.2. Therefore, the actual math result is going to be 0.9, 0.8, 0.6 in terms of scale. So you're going to see something like that. We're going to go here, and when I start dragging, you can see that my scale is going to 0.9, 0.8, 0.6 until we get to a very low number. And then on release, we went back to original position thanks to the unended event. So while we're here and while I'm dragging in the Y position to more than 50, then maybe I can sort of close this state. So what I'm going to do here is right before self.activeView to 0, we're going to set if self.activeView.height is bigger than 50, then I'm going to reset my state. But I have multiple states here. We have show, active, and also we need to set the active index to -1. So we have to do all of that here. So self.show is equal to false, self.active is equal to false, and then self.active index is equal to -1. Let's take a look. Now I'm gonna click here and I'm gonna drag a little bit, let's say more than 50, and I release and it goes back to the main screen. Let's add more effects. So I'm gonna go right after scale effect. I'm going to do Shift Command and L. I'm going to the modifiers, and here I'm going to type 3D rotate. So rotation 3D. I'm getting some default values here, and I have the degrees. I have X, Y, and Z values. I'm going to change the X value to 0, the Z to 0, and this is what I have. For the degree, we can see how it's going to look like at 30. Sometimes, by the way, when you change these numbers, it doesn't show, so you're gonna have to restart the live preview. So this is what it's going to look like at degree 30. But what I can do is to change that to self.activeView.height. So self.activeView.height. And let's see, we have an error because it is a double, so we're gonna fix it automatically, changing this value to a double. And so you can see that it's rotating a little bit too suddenly. So we can definitely divide that number by 10. And this should be a lot better. Not too bad. What's really cool is that SwiftUI takes care of all the changes in the animation, so we don't have to take care of any of that stuff. And now, just for fun, we can add something called hue rotation. Honestly, this is the first platform I've ever done this kind of effect before, but you can see that it's using the degrees number and it's just changing the hue of the entire thing. So yeah, we can just use a self.activeView.height, and we're gonna need to put that inside a double like this. So you're gonna see when I drag, it really changes the color. It's kind of cool. Of course, it's a little bit flashy, but I just wanted to show you this technique. Okay, so we definitely have a few issues here. And for example, when I drag in this particular screen without going to full screen, I can still do that effect. So one cool thing you can do in SwiftUI is that you can set a condition for the modifiers values. So for example, if I don't want to enable the drag gesture, I can do so by setting a condition. I can say show ? So only when this card is active, then enable this gesture, otherwise put it to nil. So that's pretty cool. And like this, I cannot enable this gesture when I'm inside this screen, which is not activating any of the card. Next problem, we're gonna go to the full screen, and you can see that I can really drag very low, and at some point it kind of becomes crazy. So I can definitely set a drag limit. So to do this, I'm gonna go to the unchange event, and right before the line of code inside, I'm gonna set if value.translation.height is smaller than 300, then run this code. So open the curly braces and close the curly braces. And now you're gonna see that when I drag this at a certain limit, I can't drag anymore. So you can see that the if statement here is pretty straightforward. But the problem is that it's going to add indentation, and when you have so many indentation, it creates a pyramid, and sometimes it's really hard to read. So what you can use instead is to use the guard. And with the guard, I don't have to use these curly braces. So I'm just going to delete that first. And I can say guard my condition, which is make sure to drag less than 300 in terms of distance. And if you're not fulfilling this condition, so else, curly braces, return. So what this means is that make sure to drag less than 300. If not, then return. Return means that stop running the code from here. And the cool thing about this is that you don't need to wrap this code inside these curly braces in order to fulfill a certain condition. You can just use the guard, and if it's not fulfilling this condition, then return, which means stop running the code. So let me do another guard. Guard value.translation.height is bigger than 0, else return. Now you're gonna see that I cannot drag it up, which means that if it's bigger than 0, then don't do it. If I comment this line, you're gonna see that I'm able to drag up, and therefore the scale is going to go up, as well as the 3D rotation. It looks kind of weird, which is why I added this guard, making sure that you cannot drag up to scale up my card. As you can see, it's much cleaner to use guard instead of having if and then another if inside the if, and then run this code inside 2 wrappers of curly braces. Next, we have another issue, which is that only this top portion of the card is able to drag. Now I cannot drag here. So what I can do here, I know it's a little bit repetitive, but that's the most straightforward way for me to show you how to solve this issue. So we're just gonna use the gesture modifier, the entire thing, from .gesture parentheses to the end of parentheses. I'm gonna copy this, and I'm gonna go to the ZStack container, and right before ignoring save area, I'm gonna put that gesture. Let me just fix the indentation. And now when I go here, I can drag from this portion as well. Therefore, I don't have that scroll issue anymore. I know this code is ugly when you have to repeat the same code twice, but if we had to abstract this, it can also mean a lot of trouble because we have so many moving parts and so many states. All right, before we go, one last thing I want to show you is while we drag this, let's say we want to change the background color too. So what we can do is to set this state into a binding instead. So go to line 71 and we're going to set it to binding for the active view. And therefore we don't have a default state value anymore. We're going to set it to of type CG size. And since it's a binding, I'm going to have to set a state to course list at the very top of the document and set state var active view is equal to CG size dot 0. And we're going to pass this active view to our course view component. So insert, let's put this in another line, and then set self dot $ active view. Since the active view is now bound to the course view component, and now I can have those values from the drag, I can just apply that to the black color. So I'm going to apply that to the opacity itself. Let me delete everything inside the parentheses, and I'm going to set self.activeView.height divided by 500. This is expecting a double, so I'm going to have to fix that. And this should be fine. I'm going to resume my preview and go here, and when I drag, you can see that the background is changing the opacity while I'm dragging, depending on how much I'm dragging. So we learned a lot of really cool techniques today. We learned how to drag this, how to deal with some transformation, and how to set some drag limits, how to disable the gesture based on where you are, and also how to change the background as you drag. I think what we have now is pretty cool. There's definitely a lot of stuff that you can play with, so please have fun with these interactions. I'll definitely see you in the next session where I'm going to teach you how to create an entire new view and then inject that on top of the current UI so that we can start scrolling some dynamic content using the if statement. I think it's going to be very interesting. So I hope to see you in the next session. Hey, what's up? My name is Meng. Welcome to the 33rd session of my SwiftUI course. Today we're going to do something really curious. So you can see here that we're opening to a new UI, but each of these UIs are from the content of the card. It's not really anything new from another completely different view. It's the same view, and that can be pretty overwhelming, And also we have some scroll issues. So that prevents us from showing a ton of content from this UI alone. So what we're going to do here, we're going to create an entirely different view, and we're going to inject that on top of this one as if it was all part of this current UI. So think of it as an exact replica of what you see here, but from a completely different view with more data, allowing you to scroll through a lot more stuff. So let's start by going to the navigator. And here I'm gonna right click on course list, new file, and it's going to be a SwiftUI view. I'm going to name that course detail and then create. And this is where I'm gonna recreate that UI. The first thing is we're gonna need some data. So I'm gonna set var course of type course. Now it's going to complain that it's missing some default value for my preview, so I'm going to set that to course data using the index 0. At this point, we can just copy and paste pieces of code from course list. So we're going to scroll down and we're going to find, first of all, the card here, and that card is part of this VStack here. So I'm going to copy and paste from line 95 to before gesture. So clip shape, and until line 133, go back to course detail, and at line 15, instead of the text component, we're gonna paste all of that VStack. Let me just arrange the indentation, and now you're gonna see that it's missing the show state. So let's do that. I'm gonna set binding var show of type boolean. It's going to complain that we don't have any value for that, so we're going to add that for the preview. We're going to set a dot constant to true because this is in full screen mode. All right, so let's take a look. We're going to resume this, and voila, as you can see, we have the top portion of the full screen card. I'm going to put this card inside another VStack. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the text content underneath all of this hero content. So I'm going to go back to course list, and the text content is at the top. So let's start from the VStack where it says line 77, alignment dot leading, and I'm going to copy until dot padding 30, so at line 87, and I'm gonna bring that to course detail and put that right after dot padding and dot shadow, so at line 57, and then paste all of that stuff. Next, we're gonna put all of this stuff inside a scroll view. So the parent VStack, command click, embed in VStack, and then I'm going to change that parent VStack to scroll view. Next, we're going to make sure that we're going to ignore the save area. So for the scroll view, I'm going to scroll at the very bottom. So it's always the third end of curly braces before the end. So 1, 2, and 3. This is my scroll view, and I'm going to add dot edge ignoring save area to dot all. Let's play this, and I should be able to scroll the content. And the more content that I have, the more I can scroll the content. And at this point, I can just add as much content as I want. I can make it dynamic and so on. So this is essentially an entirely new screen. Now, if you're confused with all of this copy and paste and going back and forth, I totally understand. I'm going to put all of the code from the entire page, and you can just start from here. Okay, so with this UI done separately, we can go back to course list, and we can scroll at the very bottom right after on top gesture, and then we're going to show that UI. So I'm going to do if show, so if my card is active, curly braces, I'm going to summon that course detail screen, and I'm going to fill all the content that I already have from this component. So it's going to be course, and then the show is going to be show. But let's not forget the binding as well. So what should happen here is that when I tap here, there's going to be a new view. So the one that I just summoned called course detail, that's going to sit on top of the first one. And in this new view, I can scroll the content. I can have anything I want separately. It's going to be a lot easier to manage than doing it from the course list. Let's deal with the background issue first. So I'm going to set .background to color.white. All right. And then on this specific course detail, I don't want to have any transition at all because it's just sitting on top of what we already have animated. So let me set .animation to nil. Let's take a look. Voila. At this point, we cannot tap to go back, so we're going to have to add that interaction for on-tap gesture. But you can already see that in this specific screen, we have the scrolling, we have new content, we can manage from a separate view. All right, let me disable the navigator and then switch from here instead. Going to the course detail, I'm going to add the on-tap gesture for my close button. First of all, I don't need the logo anymore. You can see here it has the course logo. I just want to have the X mark, which is the close button, and I also don't need the show opacity animation anymore, so I'm just gonna delete that part. Now you can see that this VStack here is my close button, so I'm going to add a new dot on tap gesture, and this is where I'm going to change to the close state. So I'm gonna set self.show is equal to false, and I also have two more. If you remember, self.active is equal to false, and also self.activeIndex is equal to -1. Now these states haven't been created yet, so I'm gonna scroll at the very top and create new bindings. So at binding var active of type boolean, and then at binding again var active index of type integer. And scroll at the very bottom, put all the missing values such as active. I'm going to set .constant to true. And finally, we have the active index, and this one is going to be .constant -1. And finally, we're gonna go back to course list, and where we summon course detail, we also have to put the missing states. So active is going to be $active, and active index is going to be $active index. So this is what we have so far. We can close from the close button, and it works pretty seamlessly. Now it's not perfect, and I have to admit that I haven't mastered this UI here, this solution. And if you're a developer and if you have found a solution for this, I would love to hear it because I'm still perfecting this part. But you can see that I can scroll, and at some point though, the drag is sort of in the way, and you can see right here. So what we're gonna need to do to solve this issue is to simply disable the drag. There are several ways to go about this. For example, you can go to self.activeView and just comment that out. So now you're not gonna have that problem anymore. So this is what we have so far, and it is summoning a new view. You can scroll the content, you can close the view, come back and forth. It's not perfect. So what I'm gonna do, since I do want to keep the gestures, I'm going to comment out this technique, which is simply summoning the course detail, and I'm gonna re-enable the gestures. But I wanted to show you this technique because I think it's a very interesting one. It's going to allow you to essentially summon any view you want and create a very smooth transition from this design here. Until I find a perfect solution to deal with all of these small issues, I'm going to comment this out. So this is a version without summoning a new view. We still have our beautiful gestures. In the future, I'm going to revisit this technique and make it perfect with all the scrolling and the gestures. But yeah, we're now ready to deal with real data. So in the next session, we're going to learn how to do an API call. We're going to use JSON, we're going to use combine. I think it's going to be very useful to a lot of people. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, my name is Meng and welcome to the 34th episode of the SwiftUI course. I think a lot of people anticipated this one. We're going to learn about API. So right now we're using a data that is pretty static and we put it right here at the end of the course list document. And this is great for prototyping and also great for static content. But oftentimes you're going to get data from the web using an API, a JSON. And the question is, how do we get that data and then fill the data so that it's dynamic on top of the static data that we already have here? And it's going to work exactly the same. So we have the same UI, except that it's going to be coming from an API instead. There are a bunch of APIs that you can use to test your data. So for example, we have UI names where you get a bunch of users with their avatars, their names and location. And we also have UI faces, very similar to UI names. And then we have JSON placeholder, which is really cool for a number of types of posts, comments, album, photos to do. And this is what we're going to use today to make an API call and create a list interface. And then we're going to use combine to quickly update every single view in our app dynamically. When you look at the API, the first thing you need to know is what kind of data you're receiving. It's important to match that data to your data model in SwiftUI. So for example, we're going to use the title and the body, and these names have to be exactly the same. So we're going to go back to SwiftUI. I'm going to open the navigator, and this is where I'm going to right click on update store, and I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be called data. So data. All right, so I don't need the UI part, and I'm going to create a new data model. So struct post colon. It's going to be of type codable so that we can use a JSON format, and comma, and then identifiable so that we can loop through the data and make it easy to read in SwiftUI. As you know in the past, for identifiable, we're going to need to set the ID. So let ID is equal to UUID parentheses. And then we're going to set the title. So var title of type string, var body of type string. Now to make the API call, I'm going to write it right after the struct. It's going to be a class, so class API, curly braces. And then we're going to create a function inside this class. So func get post, parentheses, curly braces. Now for making an API call, we're going to need to have the URL. So we're going to declare it, let URL is equal to URL in caps, parentheses, and we're going to have to find the string. So string right here is going to use the string, which is very simple, between double quotes, and we're going to get the link to the API. So again, from JSON placeholder, I can just click on the post and I can get the URL from here, which gives me the JSON format of the data. And using this URL, I'm just going to put that in between the double quotes. Let me just minimize the right part since we don't need it at this time. And now it's time to make the API call. So URL session dot shared dot data task, and we're gonna have to find the one with URL but also the completion handler, which allows us to get the URL back after the API call. So let me double click on this one, and the URL is going to be my URL that I just declared right here, And for the completion handler, you can just click on the blue part and then press enter. And this is going to allow us to set the names of the data that we get back from the response. So in terms of data, I'm going to set it to data. And for the rest of the responses, I'm just going to set underscore. And that simply means that I'm not going to use it for now. So we're getting an error, and that's because the URL here cannot be an optional. So what this means is that this value here has to have something. It cannot be empty. And basically, there are a few solutions to this. It's either you say, okay, you put an exclamation point, and that's like saying this value will never be empty. And I guess you're asking, well, why is this important? Well, the thing is with Swift, everything is type safe. And when it's type safe, you have access to a bunch of options for each type of data. So whether it's a string or a color, well, Swift has to know that it is absolutely sure that this is the data that they're supposed to receive. And if it's not, then it's going to crash your app. So oftentimes when you're dealing with a lot of data, such as the string, or you're making an API call, and if the data you're getting back from your API call is not the one that you're expecting, then it will crash your app. So oftentimes, especially when you dive deeper into Swift, you're gonna have to create conditions saying, okay, this has to be absolutely this type of data. Otherwise, don't run this code at all because it's going to crash my app, and I would rather just put an error message instead of crashing the app. So back to this exclamation point, it's like saying, I know for sure that there's gonna be a value that I can use, and it is the type of URL. But there's another way to do that, which is safer, is to delete the exclamation point, and we can do guard, let URL is equal to the URL string, and then else, so if it's not a URL, it's going to be otherwise, curly braces, return, which means stop running this code. So you can see that because I set a condition using a guard, I didn't have to set the exclamation point. So yeah, this is about the optionals in Swift, and I would definitely recommend that you read a little bit more about this topic. And this is going to come useful as you dive deeper into SwiftUI and you deal with a lot of APIs. So back to our API call, we're making the URL session and then we're getting back data. We don't really want the rest, so we just put the underscore. And now we're going to do something with the data. Since we're using a JSON format, we're going to have to decode it in Swift. So to do that, we're going to have to do let post is equal to try, exclamation point. This is necessary when you want to do a decode in JSON. And JSON decoder, parentheses, dot decode. And here it's going to try to decode. It's going to need the data model. So square brackets, post, dot self. The data that we're using is the data, so the response that we're getting back, and this has to be our data. So that's why we're using the exclamation point. Now that we have decoded our JSON format, we can decide to print that into our console. And the last thing we need to do is to add .resume for our URL session call. And now we're ready to test this function. I'm going to do the tests in a new UI. So right-clicking on data.swift, I'm going to click on new file, SwiftUI view. I'm going to call that post list because it's going to be a list of posts. So create that. And so this is my UI. I'm just going to open this and then resume. So in your view, one thing you can do to test your function is to use the modifier called onAppear. And this happens when the UI is being seen, and in this case, the text itself. So as soon as we see this in my screen, then run the function. So API parentheses, which is calling the class that I created in data.swift, and in that class we have getPost. Now in order to test the console, I'm going to have to click play on the live preview. And here I don't really see the console from the live preview. If you were to run on your iPhone simulator, you will be able to see the consoles. But there's a little trick in the live preview where you right click here and you click on debug preview. This is going to allow you to run live preview with console logs as well. So now you can see that I'm getting a bunch of data from the API. Now, what this means is that it's working, and that's exactly what we need to know. Now, let's make our API a little bit more flexible. So we're going to go back to data.swift. And so what we want to do here is when we make the API call, we want to return something, which is the post that we have here. So we're going to go to our function name, and inside the parentheses, I'm going to write completion, colon, escaping. And here, don't forget the commercial A, and then parentheses, and I'm returning, so square brackets, post. Square brackets means that I'm gonna have an array of post being my data model. Finally, let's get out of the square brackets and the parentheses, and space before the last parentheses. I'm going to set arrow, so dash plus forward arrow, and parentheses, so I'm returning something. So thanks to this, I'm going to be able to return values for this function. And that's exactly what I'm going to do right here instead of printing. I'm going to type completion, parentheses, and I'm going to put post. Before we go back to post lists, I just want to point out that oftentimes when we are making an API call, it has to be done asynchronously. So what this means is that you don't want to have to wait for the call to be over in order to load your UI. So you're going to have to use dispatch queue.main and then async. So this is how you type it, dispatch queue.main async, curly braces, and we're going to put the completion handler inside the dispatch queue. This is going to allow us to interact with the app while running the API call. So I know that this is a lot to take in, but API calls are never easy. There are definitely a lot of moving parts, but I'm happy to say that this is the most complex part of the API. From here, it's gonna get a lot more fun. So let's go back to post list. And for our API call, you can see that we're using get post, but it's empty. So we're gonna retype this and we're gonna use the completion instead. And then you can just press enter. So here we're getting back the value thanks to the completion. We're just gonna name that post. And then we're gonna store those posts inside a state. So let me declare a new state. So state var post of type square brackets, post, and we're going to set some default so that while we're loading the API call, we're going to have empty results. Now with this state declared, I can just update that state. So we're going to do self.post is equal to post. And this is obvious why we need the self, making the difference between self.post and then post that we get from the API call. Now that we have received the post, we put it in the state, we can now apply to our UI. So let me double click here and let me resume my live preview. I can just stop the debugging from now and just minimize my console. So what I'm going to use here is a list. So command click on the text, embed in list, and instead of using some empty data, I'm going to use the state post. So post, and then I'm going to rename the actual value that I'm getting from it as post. Now you see that it's empty, and that's because we're making the API call on appear. But if there's nothing, which is right here as default, then it's not going to run this specific modifier. So I'm going to have to move this on appear to the list instead, because the list is visible. Let me just fix the indentation. And then let's run the app. Boom, voila. We have the API call, and we know that the number is based on the API. We just need to apply the actual data from the value post. So instead of doing hello world, we're going to put post.title. There you go. So in the next session, we're going to connect all of this beautiful data to combine, and we won't have to use on appear here. It's going to be a lot cleaner. And on top of that, it's going to be always updated when the API changes. So I'll see you in the next session. Hey there, welcome back to the 35th session of the SwiftUI course. In this session, we're going to learn how to use combine and connect that to our API so that the data that we get from the API is constantly up to date with new changes. So we're going to create a new file for our combined data store. So we're going to right click on data, new file. We're going to name this one data store. And then we're going to delete the UI part. We're going to import combine. Let's start by creating our class. So class data store, colon, observable object, curly braces. Then we're going to publish our post. So at published var post of type square brackets, because we have an array using the data model post. And it's going to have a default of empty array. Now for our data store, we're going to have to run the function from our data.swift. So get post. Let me create the function first so that I can update my published post. So func get post, parentheses, curly braces, API, parentheses, dot get post. And I'm going to use the completion, getting back my post, just like what I did in the post list UI. And using the post, I'm going to update to my published var post. So self.post is equal to post. And what you want to do is to make combine run this function when it's initialized. So we're going to use init, enter, and for the parentheses is going to be empty. Then for the statements, we're going to replace that with get posts, which is going to run our function. And that's it. Now we can go to the UI. We're going to go to post list. And here you can see that we're running the API using the onAppear event. Instead of doing that, we don't need to use this because we can just replace that with combine. So we're down to our list and using the post. Right now it's empty. It's not making any API call. So what we can do is replace this by observed object, not observable, but observed object. Var store is equal to our data store, parentheses. Now our state post doesn't exist anymore. We're going to have to use the store instead. So let's add store.post. So this should work exactly the same. I'm going to resume and you're going to see it's working. So what is cool about this is that if I go to a data store and I'm deciding to update the data, well, any UI that is using and observing this data object will automatically update everything in its list. So combine is really useful when you're sharing the same data across multiple interfaces, and is especially useful when you're making modification. And anytime you're making those modifications, you want every UI that is using that data to be fully synchronized. All right, let's also use the body. So I'm going to add text, parentheses, post.body. And now you can see this is what I have. I'm going to put that inside a VStack instead. So VStack, and let me just move my body right here. Let me align my text. So parentheses alignment, colon, dot leading. And I'm going to add a bit of spacing using spacing of 8. Let's add a bit of styling to our title. So dot font, parentheses, dot system. And we're going to use a custom font. This is not part of the main UI, so it's going to be fine. So I'm going to use text style and then font design. So text style is going to be dot title, and let's use the serif font, which is kind of nice. So this is what I have. We can also make it bold, so dot bold parentheses. As for the text, I'm going to use dot font parentheses dot subheadline, and I'm going to change the color, so dot foreground color dot secondary. The cool thing about using secondary is that it's going to automatically update to dark mode as well. As you can see, this is what we have so far, and it's just a few lines of code we managed to get this far. Alright, before we finish, let me take care of some more guard. So I'm gonna go back to data, and remember that we use guard here because we had to deal with the exclamation points. So we use this guard here for the URL, that's why we didn't have an exclamation point here. We can do the same as an exercise to the data. So anytime you're using these exclamation point, you can definitely use a guard for it, so that you're creating a condition in which if the data is not existent, then do something else or not run the code at all. So let me go back here, and I'm gonna get rid of that exclamation point. We're gonna do guard let data is equal to data, else curly braces, return. So this is simply ensuring that our data is the type that we are anticipating, and therefore we don't need the exclamation point anymore. Because doing it this way with the exclamation point, if the data is not the one that we're expecting, well, this is going to crash. So by doing this way, instead of crashing, it's simply going to stop running the rest of the function. And a lot of people just put error messages and stuff like that. So yeah, as I mentioned, if you want to learn more about optionals and guard and try, you should definitely check the Swift documentation from Apple. There's even a free Swift book in the bookstore, so you can learn more about the Swift programming when you need it. So yeah, this is what we have created so far, and we use API data from JSON placeholder. I definitely recommend that you try the other ones, such as comments, photos, to-dos, and even UI names, as well as UI faces. In the next session, we're going to learn how to use the Swift package manager that is built in inside Xcode, and we're going to use a library called Contentful for CMS. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, my name is Meng. Welcome to the 36th session of my SwiftUI course. So we're back to our course list UI, and this time we're going to learn how to use Contentful to replace the static data that we see here. Now, in order to use the Contentful API and the CMS, we're going to have to use a Swift package manager. And thankfully in Xcode 11, we have that built in. So we can just go to File, Swift Packages, add package dependency. And here it's going to require a URL to the library. Now we just need to go to our browser and search for Contentful iOS. And here we're going to go to their website. They have an SDK. We're going to go to the GitHub project for Swift. And this is going to work with our SwiftUI project as well. So I'm going to go to the clone and copy this specific URL here, and that's how I'm going to be able to paste it to my URL in my Xcode. So next, and then it's going to ask you which version. Just select the one that comes with next major, and there you go, you have installed your iOS library. So far you're gonna find a lot of libraries for Swift, but for SwiftUI it's still fairly new, so you're gonna find a few ones that are really useful, and Contentful is definitely one of them. Now, what is Contentful? Well, basically it's a CMS that allows you to manage your content, and you can add text, photos, and then you're gonna be able to use their API to fill your app. This is useful for all sorts of content, such as blogs, products, media, images, or videos, and so on. So to create a content, you click on Get Started, and this is totally free until you reach to a certain amount of content, but it's definitely enough to get started with a simple app. You're going to want to click on Try for Free, and you can use your GitHub account or create a new account. It's really up to you. And once you're logged in, you can go to Content Model to create a structure. So kind of the same that what we do in code. We're going to create a content type. We're going to call it course and then create. And this is where we're going to add those fields. So for example, we're going to have the text, which will be very similar to what we have in course list. If you scroll at the very bottom, we have the content model for course. And we're going to try to use the same type of data so that we can just replace what is already existing. So we have the title, subtitle, image, logo, color, show. I'm going to try to do one and then I'm going to fast forward for the rest. So let's go back and we're going to go and start with title. It's going to be a short text, create. So we're going to stop at these three fields to make them customizable. And at this point, we can just save and then go to content to create a course. And from here, you can put SwiftUI Advanced 20 sections. And then you can link existing asset or you can create a new asset. And at this point, you can go to the assets folder and you're going to find the folder called URL images. You can drag and drop any of these images right here. And once that's done, you're going to see the image and publish. So that's basically it. I showed you the process on how to start from scratch, but otherwise you can always use mine. I have the API key and you're going to be able to use that to test. So back to our app, I'm going to right click on course list, new file, SwiftUI view. It's going to be called course store, enter. And here I'm going to take care of the API. So I'm going to delete the UI part, import contentful. And this is only available because I installed the library contentful. Next, we're going to set up the client. So let client is equal to client. Again, using contentful, parentheses. Here we have to set the space ID as well as the access token. If you want to know where that is, you have to go to settings and API keys. And here you have to create a new API key. Just input the name, and this is where you're going to find your space ID as well as your access token. So I already created one. I'm going to copy to clipboard the space ID, go to Xcode, and paste that right here. It's going to be between quotes, and the same for the access token. I'm going to copy the content delivery API access token and replace that here. So that's it for my configuration. At this point, I can create a function. So func get array, parentheses, curly braces. Now, if you want to know how to use the API, you can go to their GitHub library and you're going to find documentation about it. So we managed to install it through Swift Package Manager. You want to set up your client, and if you want to do a fetch, this is how you do it. So you can either fetch a single result or you can fetch an array of items. And that's the one I'm looking for. So we're going to have to set the query and then understand what field that we're going to be using. So let's do that. Let query is equal to query dot where. And here we're going to set content type ID, and the field name is going to be course, which is simply the content model. And then for making the API call itself, we're going to use client, which is what we configured right here. And we're going to do dot fetch array, parentheses, of colon. And then we're going to type entry, which is the content model from contentful dot self, comma, and then matching is going to use the query. Then at the end, we're going to use curly braces, and before that, we're going to use result in. So that's the result that we're getting back from this API call. So all this stuff is very similar to what we have done in the API part using URL session, but instead of using URL session, we're using what Contentful is providing us. But you can already see that the process is very similar. And at this point, we can just print the result that we're getting back from Contentful. And now we're going to check if the data is working. We're going to go back to course list and let's scroll at the very top, and we can put onAppear anywhere we want, such as on the color. So dot onAppear. I'm going to use curly braces instead and just call that function that we just created, call getArray. Let's resume this and then play, but make sure that you right click and click on debug preview. Now you can see that we're getting some responses for Contentful, and you can see here Contentful entry. We have 4 of them, which means that this is working. So if you compare it to the CMS itself, you can see that we have 4 records from our API. So that's really cool. And in the next session, I want to show you how to use this Contentful data and then fill our app with that. I think you'll find it really useful, so I'll see you in the next session. Hey there, and welcome to episode 37 of my SwiftUI course. Now that we're receiving data from the Contentful API, we're going to use that data to fill our UI, and we're going to connect that to Combine. The first thing is we're going to switch to the course store, and then we're going to look into doing a completion handler. So when the call is successful, we're receiving the data, we don't want to print anymore, we want to send back the array that we're receiving so that we can use that in the UI. So first of all, we're going to set up some variable for the type ID. So we're going to name this ID. It's going to be of type string. Like this, when we make this call using this function, we're going to be able to pass this specific type ID. So we might as well just put ID here instead. And then finally, after a comma, we're going to set the completion handler. So completion, colon, at escaping, parentheses, we're going to set the data model, so square brackets, using entry because that's the data model from Contentful. Then right before the end of the parentheses, we're going to set arrow, parentheses, so we're returning something. All right, so we're going to go to the API call, and instead of print, we're going to remove this. First of all, let's take a look at the GitHub project and what Contentful is suggesting when using their API call. We're doing a fetch and we're getting the result back. And here they're using a switch. Now, what is a switch? So oftentimes when you're receiving data, you don't just receive the data, you also receive other things such as the error message. And so when you use a switch, it's like saying if we're receiving the result dot success, then declare the entry right away and then print that, or result has also an error and then print the error. So this is simpler than having multiple if statements, and especially when you have multiple cases as expressed here, it's really useful and it's much cleaner to use. So going back to our code, instead of using an if statement, we're going to do switch result, then curly braces. And this is where we're going to have multiple cases from the value that we get for result. We're going to type case, then dot, and this is where you're going to see that we have both error and success from this result value. Let's start with success. And within these parentheses, we can declare the data from success. So let's name that array, colon. Now we can do our completion handler. So completion, parentheses, and we're gonna do array. And right after array, we're gonna type dot. This is where we're gonna find dot items, which contains the array of entry, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Next, we're gonna need another case, but pay attention to the way that we end these curly braces, because each case is going to be within these curly braces, despite the fact that we have no indentation for the case. So that can be a bit confusing. So right after completion, I'm gonna add another case, dot error this time, and I'm gonna declare error so that I can print it. So here, dot error, parentheses, let error, colon, this is where I'm gonna print the actual error, if there's any. So that's basically it. The last thing I wanna do is to make this asynchronous so that I can receive the data while playing with my UI. So let me do, before the completion, dispatch queue.main.async. And within these curly braces, I can just move the completion inside that. So completion parentheses array.items. Before we apply this to the UI, we're gonna go ahead and connect this to combine first. So let's import combine. So import combine. And then at the end, we're going to create the class for observable object. So class course store colon observable object curly braces. Let me scroll down a little bit and I'm gonna put publish var courses colon is going to be of type with square brackets course using the data model is equal to course data, which is our sample data that we have created earlier. And then with this course store, we're going to initialize some data using the API. So init parentheses curly braces. And now we can use this getArray function, which is going to make the Contentful API call. So getArray, the ID is going to be course, and completion, I can just press enter. And here I'm gonna receive items back. And since this is an array, I can essentially loop through that array by doing items.forEach and press enter, receiving a single item back. And let's see what kind of data I'm getting for Contentful. So let's print parentheses item. And here I can put dot. Let's see what I can have here. I have fields. In Contentful, for each record, you're gonna see that you can target each of these fields. So if I want to target title, for example, I'm gonna go back to my code and I can do square brackets, quotes, and then title. Now SwiftUI is going to complain that this value type is of any. And so when it's of any, it's usually for data that comes from an API because we don't really know if it's an image or if it's a text. So oftentimes you have to tell Swift what kind of data that we're receiving. And in this case, it's going to be a string. So I'm gonna have to say as string. And don't forget the exclamation point when you say as, so that we're sure that this is a string. All right, so let's test this data, but also let's connect it to the combine store that we just created. It's going to use some sample data. Right now, we're not gonna have some new data because we're just printing at the moment. So we're gonna jump back to course list, and this is where we're gonna use the combine store instead. First of all, we don't need onAppear anymore because we're using combine, so I can just delete this modifier .onAppear. And second of all, I'm going to replace the variable courses. Instead of using just the sample data, I'm going to use the combine store. So let me delete this and put at observed object var store is equal to course store parentheses. And now, since I don't have the variable courses anymore, I'm going to use the store instead. I'm going to go to for each loop that goes through every single card, and I'm going to replace courses by store.courses, which is using combine instead. And here, since we're using the index value to target the array, I'm going to have to replace these as well. So instead of self.$courses, it's going to be self.$store.courses. And then for the next one, which is course, it's going to be self.store.courses. And then we have 3 more. So offset, self.store.courses, and then 2 more, the frame, self.store.courses, and the z-index, self.store.courses. This should replace perfectly the data that we have before that was without combine. Now let's check our console, and we're gonna right click here to click on debug preview. It's going to run, and you can see that we're receiving the data from Contentful, and we're receiving specifically the titles. By the way, this doesn't work 100% of the time. So whenever you have these problems, you can definitely restart Xcode, or you can do a clean, or you can run the simulator instead. But if it works, this is what you're gonna see. And with this data, we can finally decide to apply it to our UI. So let me just close the console. I'm gonna go back to Course Store. And here we have to note that the data we're receiving from Contentful is called entry. It works very differently than the data model that we want to use for our UI. So what we need to do is to turn this data into the data model called course. And we're going to do that by using this loop. So instead of printing, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add additional data to my existing sample data. So let's do that. Self.courses. And here we're going to use a method called .append. And this is only available for arrays. So we're going to use .append, and then we're going to add new values to our courses. So let's use the data model called course, parentheses, and here we're going to insert. Now we just need to fill the title, subtitle, image, and so on. Let me just put each of them in its separate line like this. So logo, color, and then show. And then we're going to try to replace title, subtitle, image with data that we get from the API. So let's start with the title. We've tried that before. Item.fields, square brackets, quotes. The name is title, quotes. And we're going to set it as exclamation point is going to be a string because we're getting any. Same for the subtitle. So item.fields, square brackets, quotes, subtitle as string. For the image, it's going to be a little bit tricky because we're using a web image. It's going to use a URL. It needs to load asynchronously. And when you create native apps, it works a little bit differently, which is why we're going to use a library called SD Web Image. So for now, we're just going to use image literal. So image literal, and we're going to put one of these images, such as the Tesla. And then for the logo, we're going to use image literal as well. And I'm going to use the SwiftUI logo, color literal for the color. I'm going to use purple. And for the Boolean, we're going to set it to false by default. All right, so this should be good enough. And essentially what we're doing is we're adding new values using the same data model. And we're looping through the items that we're getting back from the Contentful API. And then we're respecting the data model, adding some custom fields from that API. So let's head back to course list, and we're gonna test if everything works. Sometimes we're still getting data from a previous run. So what you can do is do Command Shift and K to clean everything, and then Command B to build it again and then resume it. This will make sure that you're using the latest data, and as you scroll, you're gonna be able to see CMS with Contentful, UI design for developers, and that's exactly what we have from Contentful. Isn't that great? Now we've just learned how to get data from a CMS so we can make changes, and it's going to automatically update your app without having to submit another version of the app. So that's not only going to make your app so much more dynamic and rich in terms of content, but also you can use a beautiful CMS that can be changed from anyone in your team, and it's going to automatically update to the app. So that's what I wanted to show you today. I hope you enjoyed this part. In the next one, we're going to learn how to load images from a URL that are uploaded to a service like Dropbox or something similar. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome back to number 38. Today we're going to learn how to load an image asynchronously from the web, and on top of that we're going to learn how to randomize some colors as a background. If you Google web image SwiftUI, you're going to find a library called SD Web Image SwiftUI, and that's exactly what we're going to use. We're going to click there and copy the URL, and then we're going to go back and go to File, Swift Packages, add Package Dependency, paste that URL, click Next, up to next major version, just click Next again, and it's going to install our library. So we're going to click Finish, and this is where we are. I'm going to click Command and 0. Let me go back to course list, and I'm going to scroll at the very bottom because I need to change the data model a little bit. So you can see here that we're using the data model called course, and we have title, subtitle, image, but image is of type UI image, and this is using the image literal. But the thing is, we're not going to use the image literal anymore. We're going to use a URL. So instead of setting this as UI image, I'm going to use URL instead. So now that we have changed our data model, this is going to affect our sample data, but also our API call where we set the loop. Since we're using an image from the web, we're going to have to upload this to a platform like Dropbox. So let's say I have this folder inside Dropbox. What you can do is to right-click the image and then copy Dropbox link. And using that link, let me just replace the image value. So let me just go to the image. Let me delete the image literal, and I'm going to set URL parentheses. I'm going to scroll down to find the string, and the string is where I'm going to put that URL link. So double quotes and then paste that link. So again, image, colon, URL, parentheses, string, colon, and then the string for the URL. And here for my Dropbox link, I'm going to have to replace the www by DL. So this is going to allow me to use the image as is. And this is specific to the Dropbox platform though. Now Swift is going to want us to make sure that this is a URL, which is why we're going to need to add the exclamation point. So at this point, we can just put more images to Dropbox and then repeat the steps for the URL, paste that URL for the other two records. If you want to skip these steps, you can just use my code from the text content and paste these values. Now let's deal with the API call. We're going to go to course store, and here where it says image, right now it's an image literal. We're going to delete this. Then we're going to type item.fields. Then instead of targeting the field right now, we're going to do .linked asset. And this is necessary when you're dealing with an image or an asset. So linked asset at field name. So the field name is going to be quotes and image for the name. Finally, for that image, we have multiple formats. So at the end of the parentheses, we can add dot. And at this point, there are multiple values. We're going to use the URL. So again, at this point, it's going to complain, well, are you sure that this is a URL? And we have two solutions. One is to wrap everything inside a parentheses and add the exclamation point. Another solution is to have a default value. So what happens if I don't have any value from this URL? So I can do question mark, and set an empty or default value. So URL, parentheses, string, colon, and double quotes. And this is where I can put a fallback URL or keep it empty as long as it's not going to break your app. Make sure that at the end you add that exclamation point for this fallback URL. So the last part is to make sure that we're applying the web image to our UI. So now it's time to use the SD Web Image library. And first of all, we're gonna pinpoint where to replace that image. So you can go to the error images. You can see that in course list, if you click on it, we have the error here. It's not always accurate as to where you're getting that error, but if you scroll down a little bit within the course view, you're gonna scroll down and you're gonna find that image right here where it says course course.image. You can always do Command F and then course.image. You're gonna find exactly that value. Now you can see that I'm using an image element and I'm using the UI image value, which is what allows me to use the image literal, but instead I want to use the library. But first of all, we need to import that library in order to use it. We're going to go to the very top of the document. We're going to do import SD web image and select the one called web image SwiftUI. So this is the library that we're going to need. Once that's imported, let me search again for course.image, and I'm going to replace the whole image object, and I'm going to put web image parentheses, and here it's going to ask for the URL, and this is where we're going to put course.image because now it's a URL. Now we have to do the same thing for the next place. So going to the error again, we're going to click on course detail. We're going to import SD web image SwiftUI, and then we're going to search for course.image, and we're going to replace that image object by web image parentheses URL using course.image. So that's it. We can just click done, go back to course list, and then resume or preview. You might have to resume another time, and also sometimes it resets your preview. So if everything works well, you're going to click on play, and this is where you're going to find the image being loaded afterwards. So what you're noticing here is that these images are actually from the API. And just to prove that, when I click on build an app in SwiftUI part 2, you're going to see that this is the correct image. So going back, you can see that the image is correct. On top of that, you can see that there's a bit of a transition going on. There's a bit of a fade in, and that's how I know I'm using the library. So before we go, I just want to show you one last technique, which is how to randomize these colors. Right now, they're kind of hard-coded to purple. So what I'm going to do is to go to Course Store, and you can see that this is the color by default. And let me just create an array of color literal. So let colors is equal to square brackets. And here, for some reason, it won't let me use color literal as auto completion. So what I can do is just copy this from here to the array. So I can just paste it, comma, and then set a bunch of colors. So at this point, you can use whatever color you feel like it. And yeah, I'm just going to set a bunch of them. And let's see how it works in the code. So now that I have my array, I can just replace this color literal by the colors array. And then since it's an array, I can do dot random element parentheses. Now it's going to complain, and it needs an exclamation point to make sure that we're getting the color. So with this, let me just go back to list and resume again. You might have to reset. So Command Shift and K, and then Command B to build again, and then finally resume. Wait a little bit of time, and when you scroll, you can see that all of these colors are completely randomized thanks to that array that we just created. And that's pretty fun, right? And you can see that all the animations are perfectly working, and it's really, really cool what we have built so far. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next session, I'm going to show you a very powerful technique, which is how to use UIKit code, so normal Swift, to make it work in SwiftUI, and specifically we're going to use background blur and apply it to our app. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome to the 39th episode of the SwiftUI course. In this session, we're going to learn how to apply a background blur instead of a normal color background. And since SwiftUI still doesn't have a way to create a background blur, we're going to have to use something called a UI view representable, which is going to allow us to use UIKit, so normal Swift, in order to bring that feature. First of all, let's create that view. So we're going to right click on tab bar, and then new file, SwiftUI view, and then it's going to be called blur view. Here we can just delete the two structs, and we're going to type struct blur view colon UI view representable curly braces. Now SwiftUI is going to tell you that you're missing a few things to make this struct work. So let's take a look. It's going to ask if you want to add a type alias. If you click on fix, it's going to autofill this, and it's going to ask, what kind of UI view type are we dealing with. And we can deal with a text view, we can deal with a map view, and in this case, it's just a plain UI view. Our plan is to set up the UI view and put the blur view on top of it using insert subview. So let's deal with UI view first. And after this, it's going to tell you that it's missing some protocol stubs. And then after this, it's going to tell you that you're missing some protocol stubs. And usually these are a bunch of functions that comes with whatever type of object that you're using. And in this case, we're going to be using two key functions. One is make UI view, and this is simply for creating your basic UI. And then update UI view is for something that is more dynamic. So for animations or whenever there's a binding, then you can update your UI whenever there's a change. I'm not sure why they put the type alias at the end, but we can just move this at the beginning and then fix the spacing a little bit. So let's focus on make UI view. I'm going to replace the placeholder code, and now I'm gonna declare my view. And notice that I'm gonna be using normal Swift now. So to set up a view, I'm gonna do let view is equal to UI view, parentheses, and then I'm gonna set the frame. The frame is going to use a CGRect, so it's going to create the rectangle. Now I can set a specific frame using X, Y, width, and height. But in this case, I just want to use auto layout to use the full width and height. So as a result, I can just set it to 0 as a default and then make it adaptive using the content. Next, I'm going to make sure that the background doesn't have any color. So I'm going to say view.background color is equal to .clear. So this is my view, and for this function, I'm supposed to return a UI view. So let's do that right away. Return view. Okay, so now we're ready to use the blur view. And to declare that, we have to set the blur effect first. So let blur effect is equal to UI blur effect, parentheses, and here we're going to set the style. So the style is the material for the blur. So for example, you want it light, you want it dark, you want it thick, or you want it thin, or you just want it normal. So here I'm going to put dot, and I'm going to find a bunch of options that I can use. Now, you can set it to dark or light or extra light, but if you do that, it's not going to be adaptive and it's not going to work well for dark mode, for example. But if you set it to system, and the default one is the system material, this is going to automatically update to dark mode. So in dark mode, it's going to be dark, and in light mode, it's going to be light. So yeah, we can use system material, and then we can make this customizable later. Next, we're gonna set our blur view. So let blur view is equal to UI visual effect view, parentheses, and this is where we're gonna set the effect, which we just declared using the name blur effect. So we're gonna put blur effect, and voila, this is our view. Now that we have the blur view, including the style, we can insert it to the main view that we just created. So we can say view dot insert subview. Then we're gonna insert the blur view. And here at is kind of like the Z index. So if you have multiple views as part of the view here, then you can set the level. So like the layers in Sketch or in Figma. So I'm gonna set it to 0. It's going to be underneath everything. Great, now we can set up auto layout so that the view itself is going to take the full width and the full height. First of all, right before inserting the subview, I'm going to set blur view dot translate auto resizing mass into constraints. And yeah, please use the auto completion for this one. And then equal to false. And then we can set up the constraints. So we're going to do ns layout constraints dot activate. And here we have to set up a bunch of constraints. So you can see that expressed with the square brackets, this is going to be an array. So we're going to set, we're going to press enter first, and then we're going to set our constraints. There are two main ones, the width and the height. So let's do that. It's going to be blur view dot width anchor dot constraint parentheses equal to comma. So the constraint for the width is going to be equal to the view dot width anchor. This is going to ensure that the blur view is going to have the same width as the parent view. And then we have to set up the height constraint as well. So comma blur view dot height anchor dot constraint. And here sometimes it's going to propose to use the constant. The constant is just a number, so if you want a fixed number you can use this one, but otherwise equal to is going to allow you to use any view's properties. So make sure to select equal to ns layout dimension. We don't need the multiplier, so we can delete that if you were to use the auto completion. And here we're going to do view dot height anchor. So that's basically it. We just need to make sure that we don't have this placeholder code. We can just delete this. We're not going to need update UI for now. As I mentioned before, this is mostly useful for animation when your view gets changed. So for a blur view, we're not going to need this. So there are a few places that I want to use the blur view, such as the background for the content view, also the bottom card view. Let's head over to contentview.swift. And while we're here, we can resume and preview what's going on. So this is our UI, and we're gonna go and scroll at the very bottom. It's called bottom card view. And right now it's using a background here. And if I play this, you're gonna see when I click on the card, it shows me this white background. So what I can do is, instead of using a simple color for the background, I can use a view. So now that I have my blur view, I can definitely use that. So let's type blur view, parentheses, and that's it. So this, as you can see, is using the background blur in iOS. Now we definitely want to make that customizable. So let's head back and let's go after type alias. We're gonna type var style of type. So we definitely want to make the style customizable, and let's see what kind of value type that we're dealing with. So let's do option click on style, and you can see that UI blur effect dot style is the value type. So let's do that. Var style colon and UI blur effect dot style. So using this variable called style, we can replace this system material so that we can make that customizable. So just gonna put style, and then we're gonna head back to content view and customize this blur view. So I'm gonna retype it, parentheses, and here I can autocomplete with the style and replace with dot, and here I have access to the same material sheets. So the one that I mentioned before is system material, that's the default one, but you can definitely make it thinner. So for example, system material, and let's use the thin one, and let's see what kind of difference that we're getting. So you can see that the material is way thinner. You can see more of the blackness of the card. You can even make it more thin by using system ultra thin material. If you look at the difference, now you're gonna see that when I mouse over the black card, it's so apparent that the text is almost unreadable at this point. So yeah, feel free to use the appropriate material to make sure that your content is readable. And if you want to make it more readable, you can use the system thick material. And definitely use material instead of light or dark, because it's going to adapt to dark mode. Let me just put this back to thin material. And speaking about dark mode, that's exactly what we're going to learn in the next session. I'm going to show you a bunch of techniques to make sure that adapting your app for dark mode is going to be a walk in the park. So I'll see you in the next session. So we're finally at the last session of part 2, and this is section 40. Today we're going to wrap things up, and we're going to make sure that our app is fully adapted to dark mode, which is one of the biggest features of iOS 13. Now to get started, we should definitely preview our app in dark mode to see how it's going to look like. So I'm going to go to home.swift. I'm going to scroll at the very bottom to find the preview provider. And this is where I can customize what kind of settings that I want for this preview. In the past, I've shown you how to have multiple previews or how to preview across multiple devices. This time we're going to preview in dark mode, and it's super simple. We're going to put right after home parentheses, we're going to type .environment and use the auto-completion. The key path is going to start with /.color scheme tab. We're going to go to the next value, and this time .dark. So when you do that, this is in dark mode. So the main issues are definitely the colors. You can see that the background is usually white, and that's going to be easy to change. If I go to different screens, such as the content view, we have the same problem, except for the background blur, which I explained earlier that this is automatically adapting to dark mode. And we're going to go also to the menu. And again, we have some color issues. So let's fix them. Now, the first thing we need to do is to go to the assets catalog, and this is where we're going to set up our colors. The easiest way to adapt for dark mode is to either use one of their preset primary, secondary colors, or to set up custom colors in the assets catalog, and to make sure that for each color, you're going to set the dark appearance as well. You're going to have to turn on the inspector on the right, and then where it says appearance, you're going to have to select any dark, and that should be enough for cases. So you can see here that the background is white when it's in light mode or any mode, and black when it's in dark mode. So the way I set this is that I have 3 background colors, the first one being the darkest and then a dark gray. And the reason for that is because you want to set multiple layers of darkness so that the layers in front can differentiate itself from the background. Another advantage of using color assets is that you can set to one of the preset iOS system colors that automatically adapts to dark mode and light mode. And there are definitely a lot of choices. So for now, we're just going to use these ones, including the primary and secondary, which will be used for text. So let's head to home.swift, and we're going to start to apply those asset colors. First of all, let me disable the inspector, and I can even disable the navigator for now. Let me resume the preview. Let me find this linear gradient. So Command F, and I can check for linear gradient. So I found it here. I'm going to set from background 2 to color parentheses quotes background 1. Then you can see that the rest of the background is white because of the background modifier here. So I'm going to change this one to parentheses background 1. Let me run the preview, and I'm going to go to the menu, and you can see that this background here is lighter, and it's using this color right here. So what I can do is, instead of using the total black, I can use background 2 to differentiate from this other background. So let me replace the color literal by background 2. Now let's test it again, and you can see that it fits nicely. Next, we're going to go to the menu view, which is going to take care of this part. Let me click on done, and also let me pin this preview, because if I don't do that, then I won't have the dark mode preview every single time. And when I go to another view, such as when I go to menu view, I won't have the dark mode preview anymore because menu view doesn't have that modifier, and I would have to set up that dark mode modifier every single time for the previews. So for the menu view, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. I'm going to find the gradient very easily because it's a very small file. And now I want to make this menu to be on top of the darker background, so I can use background 3 for this case. So let me just set, instead of color literal, I'm going to use quotes, background 3 and background 3. So this should be good now. If I want to have a little bit of gradient, I can do at the end dot opacity 0.6, and you can see that we have a little bit of gradient here. It's definitely recommended to use opacity as much as you can because opacity allows you to adapt to different modes, but also to use the asset colors instead of using a hard color like dot white or dot black. Hopefully in the future, SwiftUI is going to support asset colors as well as system colors in the color literal window. But for now, unless you're using it for content such as these cards, it's better to not use color literals and stick to the asset colors. And another thing I can do is to replace the linear gradient by something else, such as the blur view, and use the system material instead. So system material, and this is going to be a lot nicer because when I scroll and get to this point, you can see that nice blur effect. But another thing to note is that iOS does a really good job at bringing out those dark tone to be, let's say, a layer on top to be more light than the layers in the background. And the same will apply to system colors as well. I definitely encourage you to experiment with them because they're contextual depending on if the layer is on top or underneath. Next, we're gonna go to home view and we're gonna take care of the watch rings. So homeview.swift, this is where we're gonna take care of this background that is white and also these watch ring backgrounds. Let me scroll down a little bit and I'm gonna find the button, which is this bell button here. And you can see that the background is white, so I'm gonna set it to parentheses background 3, and that's much better. The other thing is, since I'm setting the rendering mode to original, I cannot change the color. So even if I put, let's say, dot foreground color to dot white, you're gonna see that it's not changing at all. So I'm gonna have to remove this by commenting on rendering mode, and now it's going to work. But of course, I don't want to use white because it's not going to be adaptive to light mode, and I'm gonna have to use primary instead. Again, primary and secondary are best for textual content, and this is going to make sure that in dark mode it's going to be white and in light mode it's going to be black. Next, I'm gonna go to watch rings view. I'm gonna command click this, jump to definition, and then scrolling down a little bit, you're gonna find color.white, which I'm going to replace with background 3. Sometimes the preview is going to hang. What you can do is edit the code again, or you can stop and play again. One thing to note is that these text seems to automatically and magically adapt to dark mode. And that's because I didn't set any color at all. So when I'm not setting a foreground modifier for the text, it's just going to set as black by default, which is adaptive to dark mode. So yeah, if you want to keep the text black and then white in dark mode, you don't have to do anything at all. Let me just apply the same background color to the other watch rings. So let me just copy this and paste it to the other background modifier. Alright, so we're almost done. We just need to take care of the background of the content view, and that happens to be in home.swift. So we're gonna go to scroll a little bit, and then we have the menu view and then the content view. Here you can find color.white, and that's exactly what we're going to replace. So let me select color.white, and instead of using that, I'm going to type blur view and parentheses. Then I'm gonna set the style to .system material. As a result, we have a beautiful blur background that sits on top of the home UI. Here, since the bottom card view is already using a blur background, it is already adapted. We just need to change this white background. So we're gonna head over to content view, which I need to scroll up a little bit, and I'm gonna find content view. And I'm gonna have to scroll at the very bottom to find the bottom card view. Then we're gonna find the H stack and the background color white, which we can replace by parentheses, quote, background 3. All right, so you can see that everything seems to be working well. One last thing I want to show you, which is a really cool technique, is that you can see that this background image right here is mostly working well in light mode, but in dark mode is a bit too light. So what I want to show you is that you can actually make the image contextual to dark mode as well. So we're gonna head back to Assets Catalog, and we're gonna find the background 1. And if you have Sketch, you can just go to the Assets page, and you're gonna find the dark version of this image. You're gonna have to export to PDF. Otherwise, you're gonna have to re-download the assets. In the assets folder, you're gonna find background 1-dark. So back to Xcode, I'm going to open the inspector with the background 1 selected. I'm gonna go to appearances, click any dark, and this is where I can just bring my new asset to dark appearance. And that's it. I can just disable the inspector, and then I'm gonna head back to home, resume my preview, and you're gonna see we have a beautiful dark mode image, which is really cool. When it comes to accessibility, it's really important that you use the dynamic types. And also you can preview by adding a new modifier .environment, and this time is going to be keypath /.size category, and then the value is going to be, let's say, extra large. If you do that, it's going to try to show all the fonts that have dynamic types to be extra large. So for users who have set up large fonts on their phone, they're gonna see much larger types, especially these smaller texts. You can even make it extra large, and you're gonna see much bigger, as long as your text fits within your layout. The general rule for me is to use dynamic types as much as possible, such as .title, .body, .caption, and especially when you're using small text, such as these ones here, because at smaller size, it's really hard to read for some people. If you go to your layout for smaller texts that are 20 or lesser, you're gonna want to use dynamic types instead. Like this, your app is going to be far more accessible when the user has set large text. Now, ideally, you want to set it everywhere, but if you're limited and you have to choose, then definitely apply it to the smaller text below 20. Back to Xcode, one thing to note is that when you go to the update list, you're gonna find that this is still in light mode for some reason. So what you can do is to play your app and use the iOS simulator instead. And then you're gonna find that you can customize the interface style and go to dark mode. And there you go. And here it is in dark mode. And since we're using the list layout, you're gonna find that iOS does most of the work for you. And you can even see that the lightness of the gray changes depending on how far in the background it is and how many layers are on top. So this one is always lighter than the one in the background. So yeah, before we finish, I just want to deal with two last issues. The first one is we're gonna change the tab bar so that it's gonna go to courses instead. And the second one is that we're noticing this little transition that is unnecessary, so we're gonna remove that. All right, let me go to the tab bar, and this is where I'm gonna change from content view to course list. And then I'm gonna change the text to courses instead. Great, now I can switch back and forth between courses and home. And you can see that this little transition is happening all the time. And that's basically because I haven't set a specific width for this screen here. So if I do that, it's going to fix this transition. So let me go to homeview.swift and I'm gonna scroll at the very top. Here I have the scroll view, and then I have the V-stack. So I'm just gonna make sure that the V-stack is going to have the screen width. So let me go to this V-stack here. I have to scroll down a little bit to find the end of the two curly braces. This is the scroll view, and this is the V-stack. So I'm gonna add dot frame, and then width colon screen dot width. Now I'm going to run the app again, and when I switch, it doesn't have that problem anymore. I just forgot to change one last thing, which is in the course list, I'm going to search for color.white, and here I find the background. So I'm gonna set this to parentheses background 2. Let's run this one last time and set it to dark mode. And you can see that this is a result of all our work until now. Everything is adapted to dark mode. We have learned so much along the way in terms of creating animations, gestures, layout. We've even learned how to create these fully customizable ring components, and it's animated with the proper timing. And of course, we've learned how to create these beautiful transitions that are fully custom, and you can use gesture. It's detecting the scroll position, so any card will have a smooth transition back. We've also applied API data, so now all of this is dynamic, including the images that have been loaded from a web URL. So I hope you enjoyed this course that I have put so much efforts into creating the perfect flow so that anyone can follow. It's never been a better time to learn SwiftUI, so feel free to tell your friends about it. That would mean the world to me, and it's going to allow me to keep creating more content for you. And in fact, I'm actually working on part 3. So I'll see you in the next course. Hey there, my name is Meng, and welcome to part 3 of my SwiftUI course. First of all, I just want to say it's really awesome that you got this far. We've had people who launched their own apps. Many of them had their first shot at iOS development, and SwiftUI is just the perfect way to get started. But of course, there's always more stuff to learn, such as the new morphic buttons here, where we're using shadows, inner shadows, background overlays to create this awesome pressed effect. Here we're using a long press gesture to make sure that we have a minimum time before applying our button effects. So you can see only when I press for a long time that is going to switch. And we can even use that timing to create a progress effect, such as the ring that we have learned earlier, and a little bit of a masking here on the fingerprint icon. As you press lightly, the button expands, which is kind of mimicking what you see on the lock screen of iOS 13. And this is useful for interactions that shouldn't be accidental, such as the ones in the lock screen, but also the ones in the control panel of iOS. On top of that, it makes your buttons look really tactile, and you can add haptic feedback to make your UI feel more dynamic. So we're gonna learn a lot of those new techniques and then come back to our main UI, and then we can finally finish the login screen. This is the part where we couldn't squeeze in part 2, and I'm gonna make sure that we cover everything in part 3. So again, we're gonna learn the parallax 3D effects here, and the keyboard interaction, as well as connecting to Firebase. So I have a bad login. Let me put the correct login. So login, and voila, we play a Lottie animation, and now you're logged in. So this changed your state, and you're able to swipe down. Now this data is persistent, which means that if I go to Xcode and I run it again, it's going to remember that I'm logged in. So in part 3, we're going to learn how to create a sign-in experience as well as a logout. And you're going to be able to build this layout here, the animations, the keyboard interactions, as well as connecting to Firebase. And we're going to learn how to install CocoaPods so that we can use libraries such as Firebase. And then from that user data, we're going to use environment object so that we can make it available to the entire app. And finally, to make it all persistent so that when you reload the app or you close the app and you open it again, it's going to remember the user. We're going to use user defaults. So part 3 has a lot of new topics. Before we start, make sure that you have downloaded the latest files so that we have the latest assets. And part of it is going to be the fingerprint icons. And this icon is taken from shape.so. You can search for fingerprint, and then we have the ability to export to PDF. Another thing I need to mention is that we have all the source files for each section of the course if you need to compare your code against mine. And also, since we're using CocoaPods, for those who are not familiar with CocoaPods, you're going to have to open the design code XC workspace instead of Xcode project. This step will be explained later in the course, but I just wanted to show you in case you're confused about the extra files or if you open the original file and it's not building. So this is why. But otherwise, you don't have to worry about it because we're going to start with section 40, and feel free to use my template to start learning from section 41. So this is section 41, and let's talk about neumorphic design. This is a new trend, and of course, some people hate it, some people like it. For me, I just like to explore the techniques involved, and I think it's important to learn how to create inner shadows, for example. So that's why I include it in this course. Now, to understand neumorphic design, you have to sort of dial back a little bit in time. And it started with skeuomorphic design, which is what iOS started with. It's very heavy styling, a lot of shadows and lighting and textures. And in fact, before we moved to flat design, we had skeuomorphic design, which use a lot of textures such as wood, metal, paper, glass to replicate real-life objects. And the reason why we did that was to make technology more familiar to a whole wave of new users who are not familiar with technology. But nowadays, fast forward 10 years from the time that iPhone came along, most of us are very familiar with technology, so we don't need all of these visual cues to explain what a calendar should look like or what a button should look like. Instead, we're just flattening everything. We're just using a single color with a little bit of shadow and a little bit of gradient to express the depth. And that also explains why we're using a lot more animations nowadays to compensate and create transitional interfaces. So if you take a look at iOS 13, you can see that there are a lot of transitions and it's very smooth. You can even use gestures to switch between the different apps, and it's very responsive. And nowadays we have to design for a lot of screens, a lot of resolutions. And so our focus has shifted to animations, interactions, and transitions. But that's not to say that we completely abandon any visual cues in the past. Drop shadows are still very much used, and in iOS we use a lot of gradients. We also use background blur. And with neumorphic design is just to say, well, what if you use a little bit more of that? So for example, now we can use inner shadows, drop shadow. We can set the angle of the drop shadow to be at 45 degrees angle. And we do that to make it appear more tactile, because with flat design, we also lose a little bit of that feeling. And so when you look at the design like this, you can see that the drop shadow is at a 45-degree angle. We also have inner shadows, we have gradients. It's a lot simpler than 10 years ago, but it's still a little bit more complex than what we're used to nowadays. But I think with any design, with any tool, it's how you use it and where you use it more than should you use it or not, because I think it's fun to experiment with it and to learn the techniques involved so that you can decide for yourself if it makes sense for your app or not. Alright, so let's get started. We're gonna learn how to create these buttons, the effects, the animations, the haptic feedback. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Let's go to Xcode. So the first thing we're gonna do is to create a new file right after Blur View. So right click here, new file. We're gonna call it buttons. Let me resume the preview and then put the text, set it to button. Then we're gonna set the font. The font is going to be .system, and we're going to use a size weight. The size is going to be 20, the weight semi-bold. Then we're going to set the design to rounded. Now let's set the frame of our button. So the width is going to be 200, the height is going to be 60. So now we need two drop shadows. One is the bottom right and another one that is a white drop shadow from the top left. Let's start with the bottom right. So dot shadow, I'm going to use the more options. For the color, I'm going to set color parentheses, color literal. Now feel free to use black with opacity, or sometimes you can even use a light blue, for example, like this one. But since I have my own drop shadow color, I'm going to copy and paste this one. And you can find that in the text content of the course. Feel free to use mine instead. The color literal code you're going to find in the text content is going to look similar to this. But first, I'm going to have to comment, and you're going to find that it starts with the hashtag and then a bunch of values like this. So when you paste that code, it's going to turn into a color box. For the radius, I'm going to set it to 20, x 20, y 20. Now I just need to make sure that I have a background. So I'm going to set a background color.white for now. So now I have my drop shadow. I just need to add another one. Let me copy and paste the same drop shadow modifier. And for the second one, I'm going to set it to white. And instead of using x20, I'm going to set to -20 and y -20. But the problem is when you have a white drop shadow, it's not going to show on a white background. So we're going to have to set the entire background as off-white. First of all, I'm going to command click on the text, embed in VStack, and then I'm going to set the frame, so dot frame, to max width to dot infinity, max height to dot infinity as well. Then I'm going to set the background color, and it's going to use a color literal, so color parentheses, and then I'm going to paste a lighter color versus the drop shadow. This background is going to ignore the save area, so we're going to add a new modifier, ignore save area dot all. Okay, so already you can see the white drop shadow from the top left and the slightly darker blue drop shadow from the bottom right. Now I'm going to set the rounded corners for the button. I'm going to go right after the background color.white. I'm going to set it to clip shape, rounded rectangle, parentheses, corner radius, which is set to 16, and the style dot continuous. This is going to give us the smooth corners in iOS. Next, we're going to deal with inner shadows. As it is, we cannot create inner shadows using the shadow modifier, but what we can do is create a background modifier and put a blur layer to create that inner shadow. First of all, let me color that background. Right now it's white, and I'm going to set it to a light blue. So I'm going to use the same light blue as this one. So copy and put that inside parentheses after color, and then paste. Now this is the color of my button, and at the same time, when I'm going to add a blurred white layer on top of it, it's going to be the color of my inner shadow. But first of all, I'm going to need to set this inside a Z-stack. So command click on the color, embed in VStack, and change from VStack to Z-stack. So now I can add more color layers. Then for the second color layer, I'm going to create exactly the same shape as my current button here. In fact, I can just copy and paste the rounded rectangle code, which I'm going to put right here. This is a simple rounded rectangle with corner radius 16 and style continuous. Then I'm going to set it to a foreground color to dot white. Then I'm going to add a new modifier called dot blur, and I'm going to set the blur to 4. As you can see, we have some inner shadows in our button. So what's left to do is just to move that white layer. So you can move it to the bottom right and you're gonna get more inner shadow from the top left and vice versa. So let's do that. Dot offset X, I'm gonna set it to -8, Y to -8. Then if I wanna add another inner shadow from the top left, then I'm gonna create another rounded rectangle, the same one, so using corner radius 16 and style continuous, and set foreground color to color literal. I'm gonna use the same one as the background. So just copy and paste inside the parentheses. So for the third color layer, I'm gonna have to get a bit creative. Instead of just moving to the bottom right, which is going to hide my previous inner shadow, I'm gonna make it smaller. And one way to do that is to use padding. So I'm gonna use padding and I'm gonna set it to 2. And now thanks to that, you can see that I have a slight white inner shadow while keeping the bottom right inner shadow as well. I just need to add a bit of blur. So dot blur, I'm gonna set it to 2 as well. Now, of course, you can play with the colors. So for example, this third color layer can be slightly lighter. So I can just go to the color wheel and make it a little bit lighter, for example. And now it's gonna be more apparent. So we have the color of the actual button, we have the white inner shadow, and a slightly darker inner shadow. But there's another thing you can do, which is to create a gradient instead of a flat color. So instead of using a foreground color modifier, I'm going to replace that with fill instead. And fill is going to allow me to have a gradient. So inside the parentheses for the fill, I'm going to be able to Command Shift L and then insert a linear gradient. And for this gradient, I'm gonna set it starting point from top leading to bottom trailing. As for the colors, I'm gonna set from light blue from the top left, and at the bottom right is going to be white. Let's set white first for the bottom right. And for the first one, instead of red, we're gonna set parentheses, and I'm gonna use my own light blue color. And boom, now you have your neumorphic button. As you can see, regardless if you hate neumorphic buttons or not, you have to admit that there are so many options in SwiftUI that allows you to create very creative UIs, such as this button right here, by using a combination of techniques such as background, shadows, clip shape, and of course a Z-stack with 3 layers of colors to create this very complex styling. And the best part is everything is done in code, therefore we're going to be able to animate it, make it interactive, and in terms of the visual, you can make it more contrasting or have different drop shadows or inner shadows. It's entirely up to you. I'm just going to set the indentation by using Control I. So in the next session, we're going to learn how to animate this button to create a press state. And we'll also learn how to use the long press gesture. So I'll see you in the next session. Hi, and welcome to section 42 of my SwiftUI course. Today we're going to learn about the long press gesture. So you're going to be able to do a quick tap, but also if you press it long enough, it's going to activate an animation. So in order to set this up, we're going to create a state right at the beginning. Type state var tap is equal to false by default. So before moving on to the long press, we're going to deal with the simple tap first, using the long press gesture though. We're going to go to or button modifiers, and right after shadow, we're going to add a new dot gesture. Inside this gesture modifier, we're going to type long press gesture parentheses. Let me just indent this. And then the long press gesture pretty much has the same events as the drag gesture. So we can use dot unchanged And then we can remove the parentheses, curly braces, space, value in, enter. So this unchanged event is basically the same as the tap gesture. Here I can set self.tap is equal to true. So specifically for this button, we can make it so that when we tap on it, it's going to simply expand and then come back. To do that, we're going to use a scale effect. So right before a gesture, we're going to add dot scale effect. Inside the parentheses, we're going to set tap question mark 1.2, otherwise 1. Since I played with the variables at the beginning, I'm going to have to resume my preview and play. So now you're going to see that when I tap, it simply expands. I just need to add some animation. So I'm going to go to the parent container, and right after edge ignoring save area, I'm going to add dot animation, and I'm going to use dot spring with the response, damping fraction, and blend duration. I'm going to set to 0.5, 0.5, and 0. So because I set this at the parent container, it's going to apply to every button inside this container. So if I click here, you can see that it has a little bit of a transition with bounce back. Now you can see this kind of interaction in iOS in a lot of places, such as the control center. I can't show it to you right now, or the lock screen, which doesn't really show it. But definitely here, when you long press this, it doesn't matter if it's a long press or a tap, you can see that it has a little bit of a bounce back effect, and it's kind of neat. So in order to achieve this, what we can do is to set a delay right after the tap. So I'm going to use dispatch queue.main.async with delay. So after a deadline, and then dispatch time execute, this one. And for the deadline, I'm going to set .now parentheses plus 0.1, which means it's going to have a delay of 0.1 second. And I'm going to press tab and then press enter. It's going to create the curly braces for me. And now I can set self.tap is equal to false. And when I do that and tap, it simply expands and come back to the original size. So that's definitely really fun. And of course, you can make the delay longer. So 0.5, for example, it simply expands and then come back after a delay of 0.5 second. For now, I'm going to leave it to 0.1. And now we can deal with the long press event. So right after unchanged, I'm going to type dot unended and remove the parentheses, curly braces, value in, enter. And this is where I'm going to toggle a new state called press. So that's for the long press. First of all, let's declare this new state at the very top. I'm going to type state var press is equal to false by default. Then I'm going to go back to unended. I'm going to set self.press.toggle. And at this point, I can just play with the states using animations, such as for colors, for example. So I'm going to go to the first shadow, and I'm going to change the color based on if it's long pressed or not. So here, I'm just going to switch between white and light blue. So I'm going to ask press, question mark. As you type, it's possible that your color literals are going to become code. It's going to be a bit confusing for the moment. But if you add the proper space and the proper code, it's going to bring back the color box. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do color lit, and I'm going to use another color. And then after that color lit, I'm adding a colon and a space, and this is going to fix my color box. So since I added a new press state, I'm going to have to resume my preview again. And now I can test my long press. So I'm going to long press this, and as you can see, the drop shadow just changed based on my long press. So that works, and all I need to do is to apply to the rest. To make it easier, what you can do is to copy and paste press question mark and the color code with a colon right before this color box, and put that right before the other color box for the second shadow. So I'm going to do that, make sure to have the proper amount of space, and we're just going to switch these colors. So this light blue here, copy and then paste to this box. Voila, my drop shadows are gonna switch back and forth between the long press state. By the way, you can set the minimum duration for the long press gesture. So if you want to make it activate slower, you can go to long press gesture between the parentheses, set minimum duration to, let's say, 2 seconds. And for the maximum distance, it's the distance that you can move before it fails. So that's good when you want to cancel the animation as you pressed and you move out of the button. But otherwise, if I remain within that distance and wait 2 seconds, then it's going to activate my state change. But yeah, you can definitely play with these values. A good number for minimum duration is 0.5. And for the maximum distance, I honestly haven't played that much with it, but there's definitely documentation on the Apple website, and I'm gonna link that in the course. So now let's play with the UI. We have played with the drop shadows. We can now play with the actual background. Because we're dealing with the color literals, sometimes it's just easier to just copy and paste the code. So in this case, I'm gonna copy, press question mark, color literal, and then colon. I'm gonna put that right before this one. So it gives me press and then question mark, the first color box, colon, and the second color box. I'm gonna repeat this step a lot. Remember that we have 3 color layers here, and so by default it's going to be light blue, and that's the light blue for the inner shadow here. And we're saying, okay, if I press, it's gonna become white instead. So that's already a first step. The second step would be to change the white inner shadow. And for that to work, we're gonna have to turn this color.white into a color literal. So color, parentheses, and then color lit. We're gonna set it to white. And then before this box, we're gonna paste the code. So when it's pressed, it's going to be light blue. So I'm gonna bring this light blue right here, copy, and then paste. And voila, I have my press state. I have my first inner shadow turned to white and my second inner shadow turned to light blue at the top left. By the way, I decided to keep the color literals because I know a lot of designers are following this, and color literals are really easy to experiment with. So if you want to change the light blue tone or the white tone, you can do so really easily. You're going to have very different results from mine, and that's what I like to encourage. Before we finish, let's deal with another animation. So I'm gonna go right after the background and also right after the clip shape, otherwise it's going to clip everything. So after clip shape, I'm gonna type dot overlay. And as I mentioned before, overlays is like the dot background, except it's going to float outside instead of being clipped. So let me start by creating a view, and again, everything is a view. Let me just indent this, and I'm gonna use an image, parentheses. I'm gonna use a system icon, so system name using the string, and it's going to be a person.crop.circle. These SF symbols, as we call them, you can change the property by using .font and use .system. And we're gonna use the size, weight, and design. So I'm gonna select this auto completion. It's going to be size 24, weight .light. And for the design, it's not gonna matter, so I can just delete this part. Let's make this icon white, so .foreground .white. And the frame is going to have a width of 54 and a height of 50. We're also gonna set a background color. So color, parentheses, color lit. And here I'm gonna set it to any color I want. Let's say the purple right here. And then I'm gonna set the clip shape, rounded rectangle, parentheses. We're gonna use corner radius, set it to 16, and style continuous. For the shadow, we're gonna use the same purple, so dot shadow, and we're gonna use the more options. Color, parentheses, color lit. We're gonna use the purple, and we're gonna use opacity as well. This time we're gonna use 0.3, and it's going to have a radius of 10, x 10, y 10. Okay, so that's pretty good. I just need to push this to the left right here. Let me just indent this first, and I'm going to command click on image, embed in HStack, and I'm going to use a spacer to push it like this. Then I'm going to make it float a little bit more to the left. So I'm going to use dot offset, and I'm going to use X to -10, Y to 0. It's looking pretty good. I just want to animate this using the long press state. So what I want to do here is when I long press, it's going to turn into a line that is underneath the text. To do that, I'm going to have to play with the offset, but also at the size. Let's start with the offset. I'm going to ask press, question mark. It's going to be 70, otherwise -10 by default. And then for the Y, press, question mark, is going to be 16, otherwise 0. This is going to move my button. Let's deal with the frame now. So I'm going to go to width, and I'm going to ask press, question mark, make it 64, otherwise 54. Then for the height, we're going to make it much slimmer. So press, question mark, make it 4, otherwise 50. Let's test it again. So long press, and boom, it turns into a line. The last part, we just need to make the icon disappear. So to do that, we can play with the color of the icon. So instead of white, we're going to add dot opacity. We're going to set it to 0. But the thing is, since we're adding another property to the actual value, we're going to need to specify the value, which is color. Now this color value, think of it as if it has multiple modifiers. The first one, it's white, and the second one, we're playing with opacity. So now we're going to ask, well, is it long pressed? So press, question mark, we're going to set it to 0 in terms of opacity. Otherwise, we're going to set it to 1 by default. So that's it. Now I can press, you can see that the icon disappeared, in addition to the size of the box turning into a line. So I think we learned a lot today. First of all, we learned how to set up a long press gesture. We detected the tap so that if we do a quick tap, then it's not going to do anything unless we have a long press. And it does this really neat bounce back effect. Then using unended, we're toggling the press state, and we played with the minimum duration, the maximum distance. Using that press state, we learned how to change the values of the shadows and the values of the background of the color layers, and we even had time to learn a little bit about this little animation that turns this box of icon into a line. So I hope you had fun, and in the next session we're gonna learn how to do a very fun and animated circle button. So I'll see you in the next session. Hello, and welcome to section 43 of my SwiftUI course. Today we're going to learn how to do a circle button, and it's going to open a bunch of possibilities in terms of how to animate it, but also later on we're going to learn how to do a tap progress animation using another option for the long press gesture. First of all, let's create a component out of this button right here. So I'm going to command click on the text element, and then I'm going to extract subview. I'm going to name this one rectangle button, and now it's gonna give me errors because it's going to need those states. So I'm gonna move these states and put it to the rectangle button subview. So I'm just gonna paste it right here, and with this I should be able to resume my preview. And now I'm going to create a new button, but before that I'm gonna set a spacing between the button. So for the VStack parentheses spacing, I'm gonna set it to 50. And now I can create that new button. First, let's create an SF symbol icon. So I'm gonna type image parentheses system name. The string is going to be quotes sun.max. This icon should be a little bit bigger, so I'm gonna use the font modifier using dot system with the size, weight, and design. The size is going to be 44. The weight is going to be dot light. And the design, we can just remove it. Awesome. So now I can just create a VStack as a container. So embed in VStack. And the VStack is going to be my button. I'm going to start with dot frame, width of 100, height of 100. Then I'm going to make the background white. So dot background, color dot white. The shape is going to be a circle, so I'm going to use .clip shape, and then inside the parentheses, circle parentheses. For the shadow, it's going to be very similar to the previous button, so we're going to have white drop shadow to the top left and then light blue to the bottom right. And let's set up the white first, so .shadow. The color is going to be color.white. The radius 20, x minus 20, y minus 20. Let's add another shadow, so .shadow. The color is going to be a color literal, so color parentheses color lit. And I'm going to change the color later, but for the radius, it's going to be 20, 20, 20. Let me just grab the light color as I've used before. So I'm just going to scroll down a little bit, and this is the color. So I'm just going to copy it and then paste right here for the second drop shadow. So this is what I have so far. And now we're going to create the inner shadows, but this time we're going to do it differently. So instead of having multiple shapes using blur and moving using offset, I'm going to create multiple borders using drop shadows on the border to create those inner shadows. So I'm going to go to the background and set the indentation first. Instead of color.white, I'm going to use a linear gradient. I'm going to do Command Shift and L and type linear. And voila, we have the linear gradient. Let's set up the direction first. So .top leading and then .bottom trailing. For the colors, I'm going to set it from white to light blue. So I'm going to use a color literal, so color parentheses and color lit. This one is fine, so it's going to be for white. And then for the blue, I'm going to set color parentheses, color lit. And here I have white by default. I can use a darker tone if I want, so I'm going to copy this one. And it's going to look like this, which is really interesting as well. But I'm going to use the same lighter tone as the background, which is from the background modifier. So I'm going to copy this one and then paste it right here. Now it's very subtle. Again, feel free to use your own colors. But now we're going to deal with the inner shadows. And instead of using color layers with blur, I'm going to use a shape border with drop shadow. But before doing that, I'm going to have to put this inside a Z-stack. So command click on linear gradient and then embed in V-stack. I'm going to change that to a Z-stack instead. Then after the linear gradient, we're going to insert a circle, parentheses. So now you can see that it's black. I'm going to use the stroke, so dot stroke. And I'm going to use content and line width. So press enter. For the content, I'm going to start with a color dot black, just so that it's visible. And I'm going to set the line width to 10. Next, we're going to set the drop shadow, so dot shadow. And again, color dot black. Radius is going to be 3 minus 5 minus 5. So we're moving up and left. You can see the drop shadow right here. It's pretty visible, but the outline is a little bit too much. So what you can do here is instead of using a color black, we can use a color clear, which means transparent. And there you go. That gives us our inner shadow. All that's left is to change the color. So I'm going to copy this color from the drop shadow and paste it right here, but inside parentheses. And then I'm going to add another inner shadow. This time it's going to be white. So let's create another circle, parentheses, dot stroke, color dot clear, line width 10. Then we're going to set the drop shadow, so dot shadow, color, parentheses, color lit. It's going to set to white. The radius is going to be 3, x 3, and then y 3 as well. It's very subtle, but you can see a white inner shadow from the top left. So as you can see, there are many ways to create inner shadows in SwiftUI. But at the same time, because these techniques are so powerful, you can use them for more than just inner shadows. And now we're ready to deal with the animation. But first of all, I'm going to create a component out of this. so that I can store the states inside the component instead of the parent view. So let me command click on the VStack and extract subview. I'm going to name this one circle button. And now I'm going to command click this, jump to definition, and I'm going to set the two states, starting with state var tap is equal to false, state var press is equal to false. After setting the state, we can resume the preview, and then we can set up the gesture right after shadow. So dot gesture, long press gesture, parentheses. Then let me fix the indentation. Then we're gonna set dot unchanged. Let's remove this and use curly braces, value in, enter. Then self dot tap is equal to true. Just like the previous button, we're gonna make it go back to false after a delay. So dispatch queue dot main dot async using a deadline and execute, and the deadline is dot now parentheses plus 0.1, then tab enter. For the code, we're gonna set self.tap is equals to false. Now I'm going a little bit fast because we already went through this piece of code and we're just repeating the steps. So while we're here, I'm going to add the unended as well. So unended, and delete this, curly braces, value in, enter, and set it for the long press. So self.press.toggle. Alright, so let's deal with the simple tap animation first. We're gonna do a scale effect. So dot scale effect, and we're gonna set tap question mark set to 1.2, otherwise 1. This is going to allow us to tap quickly like this. And then I want to show you how to do a quick icon animation that switch back and forth between light and dark. So let me go to the icon. We have the VStack, and then we have our sun.max icon. What I want to do here is to move this icon to the top left using offset. And also I'm going to use a little bit of a 3D effect. So let's start with the offset. After .font, I'm going to set .offset. X is going to be press question mark. I'm going to move it -90, otherwise 0. Comma, Y, press question mark, -90 as well, otherwise 0. So if I test my animation, my icon is simply going to disappear this way. Let's make it even more fun by using a 3D effect so that it feels a little bit like a globe. I'm gonna add dot rotation 3D. For the angle, I'm gonna set angle with a capital A, parentheses, degrees. I'm gonna set it to 30. And then for the X, Y, and Z, I can set the X to 10, the Y to 0, and the Z to 0. So already you can see how it's affecting the 3D angle of my icon. And if I play with it, such as put 10 to Y, you're gonna see that it's kind of angled to the top right. So I can set -10 for the Y axis, and it's going to shift to the other side. And to add the animation, I just need to add press question mark, set it to 30, otherwise 0 for the angle. So let's take a look. You can see that it's shifting just like a 3D globe. But I can see that it's not completely hiding the icon to the top left. So what I can do is to change the angle or to push it further. I'm going to opt for the angle, so I'm going to change from 30 to 20. And notice here that if you don't see this refreshing, the interaction is just going to freeze as you change the values. Of course, you can decide to restart your preview, but a trick that I found was to simply add a space, and it's going to refresh and remove the space back to the way it was. So now it's hiding the icon completely, and we have to deal with switching to the other icon. So what I'm going to do is to change from a VStack to a ZStack so I can make the second icon pile on top of the first one 3-dimensionally. So I'm going to change this one to a Z stack, and I'm going to copy and paste the entire code for the image where we have our sun.max and just paste it right after. For the system name, I'm going to change it to moon. Then I'm going to change up some numbers, such as for the offset, when it's pressed, I'm going to set it to 0. Otherwise, by default, it's going to be pushed by 90, so it's going to be hidden. So the same way for the Y, so 0, otherwise 90. And then for the rotation 3D, I'm just going to reverse. For the x-axis, I'm going to set it to -10, and for the y, I'm going to set it to 10. Finally, we're going to reverse the long press state. So instead of 20, I'm going to set it to 0, otherwise 20. Again, it does not seem to refresh, so I'm going to add a space and remove the space. And voila, this is what I have so far. Alright, so let's finish this by changing the colors of the gradient and the shadows. So we're going to repeat the same steps, and we're going to start with the gradient here. The goal is to simply reverse the colors, so from white to light blue, from light blue to white. So I'm going to do press, question mark, and then color lit, otherwise another color literal. Let me just copy the light blue here and paste it. So at this point, I'm just going to copy and paste the part right before the color literal, and I'm going to paste it for the second gradient color as well. And I'm going to make sure to reverse the color. So I'm going to set this one to white. And for the first circle, I'm going to do exactly the same. So this is going to be white. And for the other circle, it's going to be light blue. A quick way to see if it's correct or not is just to compare between these two colors. Make sure that the newly pasted one is different from the default one. Alright, two more. So the first drop shadow, I'm going to make sure to have parentheses and color literal first. And paste it right in front. And the same for the other drop shadow. Let's make sure to have this one white. And notice that the tone of the blue is slightly darker for these drop shadows. So I'm going to switch up using the darker one on the first drop shadow, but also on the circle, so the second circle as well. So make sure that these colors are the same and these colors are the same. And again, the goal is to simply switch between white and light blue, except that for the gradient, the light blue is a little bit more subtle. Awesome, so let's see the fruit of our labor today. So I'm gonna test this, and boom, we have a really nice switch of gradient and shadows as well. And I'm sure at this point you're thinking, well, what more can we do with these buttons? Well, in the next session, I'm going to show you how to do a tap progress. So as you tap, the longer you tap, the more progress there is to your animation. It's going to be really awesome. Don't miss this one. So I'll see you in the next session.